Peter McCawley, welcome to ASPI. The moment that the new president is sworn in, he goes onto the international stage. He goes to the APEC summit, the East Asia summit, the G20. What sort of foreign policy approach should we expect?
Well, I think the first thing is we're waiting to see. This is one big question hanging over him. He'll probably be inclined to, at least in the first instance, that is these first meetings, drift along with the status quo. The foreign affairs in Indonesia, foreign policy, does not occupy a great deal of attention within domestic debate, so it won't be top of his immediate domestic agenda. It's not as if the Parliament or the press will be pressing him terribly hard. So the easiest thing for him to do will be to go along with Indonesia's broadly established policies, which are pretty much a subject of consensus in Indonesia. Now, having said that, he is going to face a quite challenging question, really, as to how outward-looking, how liberal he is in economic policy. This is really the big question for the international community. APEC is focused on trade. East Asia Summit is looking at Asian regionalism, is looking at expanding Asian regionalism, and the G20, of course, places a lot of emphasis on international macroeconomic policies, liberalisation, structural adjustment, keeping markets open, this sort of thing. So he's going to have to decide what line he pitches on this, and I think that's his real dilemma. Really.
So is he going to be facing pressures to express a more nationalist, more Indonesian inward-looking approach to economics, rather than those sort of globalised market approaches that he's going to get at the G20 and from APEC?
Yes, I think he's caught in something of a dilemma here, because there are relatively strong pressures both ways. There are relatively strong pressures on him domestically to wave the Indonesian flag, to talk about nationalistic policies, and we've seen quite a lineup of rather nationalistic policies in the economics area over the past 12 months or so. And during his election campaign, Joko Widodo himself has made noises indicating that he's sympathetic to some of these. On the other hand, he realises that he does have economic problems at home, that liberalisation and opening will help him overcome. Particularly, he's been having a row with two of the very large mining companies, Freeport and Newmont, and this is something of a litmus test. The international mining community is watching Joko Widodo quite closely, and Indonesia badly needs new policies in this area. Oil output has been declining quite rapidly over the past 10 or 15 years. This is becoming a serious problem, and Joko Widodo is looking directly at a serious problem. So he's under pressure to find new and more outward-looking policies from the mining companies and from the international community. And this will be reflected in APEC. International leaders will be listening very carefully to see how he tilts on this
There's
issue.
also the need for Widodo to make some sort of impression, to start to define himself as a leader, both as an Indonesian leader and as a leader in ASEAN. What sort of response can he make to those sorts of demands, both domestically and regionally? Well,
first, we don't know much about him in this area. He has pretty much a zero track record in international relations. I mean, his background was as mayor of Surakarta, Solo. He has never shown any particular interest in this area. So this is, in personal terms, it's a bit difficult for him. It's a bit difficult for him to think about what sort of a person, what sort of an image do I wish to present. That's the first point. The second point is that he will, however, be aware, and his advisors will tell him, that he is now one of the most important leaders in ASEAN, if not the president of Indonesia is not quite the president of ASEAN, not quite, but the President of Indonesia is the first amongst equals across ASEAN, and so he suddenly finds himself a spokesman for 10 countries, ASEAN, not just one. And he therefore needs to think about first where does he want to position Indonesia in that particular role, and more generally he has to bear in mind that in a funny sort of way he's suddenly finding himself carrying a range of interests and a range of considerations that he probably has not thought much about. A range of what does Vietnam want out of ASEAN? What does Malaysia want? What does Myanmar?
And how does he then express all of that on a G20 stage, for instance? Indeed.
He'll be in APEC in Beijing for a few days, and immediately after that he finds himself down at the East Asia Summit in Myanmar, Naypyidaw, and he'll find himself surrounded by the 10 leaders who will all want to talk to him. So he'll find himself buffeted by a range of interesting challenges. Now, the chances are that, one possibility is that he will be rather Javanese about it. He hasn't looked like a Javanese leader, but he might become a Javanese leader, and he will simply nod and listen. And if he does that, there will probably be some disappointment, I guess.
How does this feed into the much bigger question of whether Widodo can actually govern?
That's really, I think, a very important issue right now. Even just in the last few days, it's become very clear that his opponent, Prabowo Subianto, has by no means given up the game. Prabowo Subianto has now carried the battle against Jokowi into the parliament. There's a red and white coalition which clearly have, at present, the majority in the parliament, and they are currently finding an early area of battle over the election of regional heads across Indonesia. This might seem a rather abstruse topic, but in fact it's a trial of strength. Prabowo Subianto and his group are saying to Jokowi, you haven't finished with us yet. You're going to have to deal with us, and we're going to make life quite difficult for you. Now it's already very early. He hasn't even been appointed, and he's already facing difficulties in Parliament. So in a way, that's probably he's going to find fairly rapidly that this is his number one challenge above all, because there's no point in him going to APEC or ASEAN if he's not the president of Indonesia. I mean, the number one requirement to hold his position is to hold a position of authority within Indonesia. And for the first few months of even before he becomes president, this is going to be the interesting trial ground for him.
Does Widodo in his first term as president face in some senses the same problem that afflicted President Yudhoyono in his second term, that he was seen as presiding, not ruling, as governing, not changing?
I think that may well be true. And more generally, we are now learning something about the position of the presidency of Indonesia. The president, what does it mean to be the president of Indonesia, and how much real power does the presidency hold? Joko Widodo and more generally SPY, they are far closer in the powers that they have to the President of the United States than they are within domestically. Than, say, the Prime Minister of Australia, in the sense that the President of the United States always has to bargain with the Congress and finds it quite difficult, and is sometimes subject to surprising rulings from the judiciary as well, that traditional three prongs of power, the administration, the legislature and the judiciary. Now in Australia we've tended to merge them a bit more, and certainly the Prime Minister doesn't have to worry quite as much, although more recently they've been worrying. But traditionally the Prime Minister of Australia has been fairly strong vis-a-vis the legislature. Well, that's not the case in Indonesia. It's much more evenly balanced, and it's a mistake to assume, and this is becoming clearer and clearer, it's a mistake to assume that the President of Indonesia can necessarily easily get his way. with the legislature. You know, for 40 years we lived with President Suharto, who made Parliament look quite unimportant. Well, the game has changed dramatically now, and this will be tested in the next 3 months, 6 months under President Joko Widodo.
This seventh president of Indonesia is not from the elite, as his 6 predecessors were. How much does he have to be careful that the elites and the oligarchies don't come after him, that they could really come after him very strongly if he pushes too hard?
Yes, I think it's an important issue, and more generally, what is now striking when you look at Indonesia is the way that power is dispersed across many institutions, both at the centre, at the province, and even at the Kabupaten, the regency level. There are close to 500 districts in Indonesia who are governed by who in Indonesian terms are called bupatis. They're called regency heads or district heads. Now there are 500 of them, and they carry a lot of power at the local level. Joko Widodo is going to find that he has to share power with a very wide range of sources. It's very diffuse. It's all across government. Of course, even within his cabinet, he will be appointing ministers from other parties who are not necessarily always loyal to him. So he will have to juggle power within the cabinet, as President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono did. He's not sure of the loyalty of even his closest colleagues. More generally, there's the whole business of handling a very difficult to manage government administration. Lots of government departments spreading out to state-owned enterprises, which are states within a state, who will nominally give the president authority, nominally give him respect, but don't necessarily follow what he does. And then further out into the provinces, 34 of them, and 500 districts. Now, this is a terribly wieldy process to manage. And that's even without looking at the political parties in the parliament. There are 560 members in the parliament, the so-called DPR. They're quarrelsome, they're argumentative, they don't necessarily see a lot of advantage in agreeing with the president, and many of them took great pleasure for 5 years in constantly prodding and making life difficult for SPY. Many of them clearly had the agenda, if possible, to bring about the impeachment of their president. So a significant proportion of the parliament are hoping that they can bring about the impeachment of the president in the way that they did with Gus Dur 10 years ago, the former president Abdul Wahid.
Because of that diffusion of power, because of that decentralisation and the way power has been diffused, is money politics, corruption in Indonesia now as bad as it was under Suharto, or is it worse?
These things are difficult to measure. It is certainly as bad and arguably worse. Why it's worse is that there are now at the centre, provinces, and at these district levels a total of close to 20,000 seats to be filled. The most important, of course, are at the central level, but provinces are important and regions are important too. They're pretty important if you're a local businessman or businesswoman and you want to deal in land, you want to get licences, and so the contest for these 20,000 positions now is very, very brisk indeed. The Indonesian political system is highly competitive, and that means money. These people running for office, and if there are 20,000 seats, you've got 80 or 100,000 people with their eye on these seats, and money is part of it. So we've seen in the last 10 years really the emergence of a new industry, or the spreading of a new industry. The industry is called politics, and like all industries, it needs cash flows. It has expenses, it's got supporters, it's got people who are paid to run the parties. They hold congresses where they have 500 or 1,000 people that they fly to Jakarta and put them up in expensive hotels. All of this costs a lot of money. The cash flow in the industry is very, very substantial. Now, they have to get money from somewhere. So it looks as if the whole business of money politics has become more and more alive in Indonesia in the last 10 years.
And how does this new industry affect not only the way Indonesia does politics, but how Indonesia can think about economics and how it's going to run and change its economy?
It makes it very difficult. It means that many of this 20,000 people, but even just focusing on the 560 in the Central Parliament, many of them are, let's put it this way, highly pragmatic. One of the current characteristics of Indonesian politics is that ideology is surprisingly weak. There are some elements of ideology in the Indonesian political scene, but the Indonesian political scene seems to be at present far more driven really by interests, by lobby groups and interest groups competing for power, competing for access, trying to influence policy. The term in economics that is sometimes used is rent-seeking, trying to ensure that policies favour them and their friends. So the broad issues of what you might call traditional political debate that we've seen in Western countries over many years, such as the size of government that we see in the United States, all of this Tea Party stuff. Should government be large? Should government be small? These things are really not much debated in Indonesia. Really, there's just competition for power. That's 90% of the game. It's probably not 100% of the game, but it's 90% of the game.
Has democracy been good for Indonesia?
That's hard to tell. If you ask Indonesians, and I think that's the key test, I think the answer is yes. Indonesians clearly prefer a much more open society, and it is now a very open and vigorous society. It's exciting to be in. I must say it's wonderful to watch the interest groups and the media, the newspapers, the electronic media and so on. It's a very competitive and open and free society. Indonesia, this is very important. If we believe that democracy and elections and so on are about freedom, Indonesia certainly has that freedom at present. But the question, I suppose, is it is sometimes possible to have too much freedom, because freedom means that terrorists have freedom as well. Freedom means that all sorts of fringe groups can try all sorts of strange ideas, can promote values and ideas that the community doesn't necessarily accept. Fortunately, what we do see in Indonesia at present is that, by and large, some fringe groups do promote some ideas, and the debate is very vigorous. But of course, it does become more difficult when one gets closer to issues of terrorism and that sort of thing, and lawlessness. Australia has had difficulties with Indonesia over the border, over the issue of people movement through Indonesia. Well, Indonesia is now so democratic that they are reluctant to be too tough on their own borders. People move backwards and forwards from Malaysia over to Sumatra. There is something like 2 million Indonesians in Malaysia, across the strait, of whom 1 million are illegals. So you have very large amounts of very large people movement across Indonesia, and that is part of the freedom. The freedom is for Indonesians to move. And part of the freedom also, or this is perhaps closer to ideology, is that there is a strong feeling in Indonesia, which is absent in Australia, of course, of brotherhood with Muslim countries. The strong feeling that they are part of a global Islamic movement. Now, that makes it difficult for them to close their borders to their Muslim brothers and sisters as well.
Peter, you've spent your whole career, your working life, thinking and talking and visiting Indonesia. What sparked this love affair for Indonesia for you?
Two things, I think. One, for me, Indonesia is a prism on the third world, on the developing world. Those of us who live in rich countries tend to have a tendency to look at America, United Kingdom, Canada, Europe, and think of this as the world. We often see it in the media. The global economy. We see these phrases about the global economy, and they tend to refer to what's going on in America and Europe and Canada, the Anglo-Saxon countries, and Europe. Well, this is not the world. It is at the most 25% of the world's population. We've got huge problems. Looking ahead over the next half century or so, the world has huge challenges, and many of them are in developing countries. Look at the problems we're looking at in the Middle East now. Look at Saudi Arabia. Look at Afghanistan. Look at these sorts of issues in the region. Now, to understand these things properly, we need to have a better understanding of the third world. And Indonesia is, for me, a prism of the third world. So that's one motivation. The other, curiously, is that I think it helps me understand my own country better. If one lives overseas, and I've been lucky enough to live overseas, if one lives overseas in Asia, of course one looks back at one's own country. One looks back at what the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition, the Parliament and the media are saying. One looks at what one's own society is doing, and one thinks about that as well. So I think it's both useful for an Australian. For an Australian who wants to live in the world, it's useful to study Indonesia or some other Asian country, some developing country. First, because developing countries are important for the globe, and second, because it helps us understand our own country.
And can you point to a light globe moment when Indonesia really came alive for you, when you said, "This is for me"?
Oh, it's hard to put one's finger on it. These things creep up on one slowly, but those of us who've worked on Indonesia, and I've got quite a few friends who have, and Graeme, you've also done work on Indonesia, it's certainly an astonishingly vibrant and interesting place. And the truth of the matter is it's often, this might sound a little harsh, but the truth is it's often a lot more interesting than Australia. I do remember one of Australia's very well-known journalists, perhaps he wouldn't wish to be named, so I won't name him, who worked in Jakarta for 3 or 4 years and came back to Australia and was sent by his newspaper to work in Parliament House. And after 6 months or so, he came over to our annual Indonesian conference at the ANU called the Indonesia Update to give us a talk. And his opening line was, "Gee, it's great to be back to talk about some politics that are really interesting." Now, Indonesia does get you that way. The issues are very serious ones. We're looking at a nation of 250 million people, the single largest country in ASEAN. It's important that it succeeds and does well, both for itself, for ASEAN, and for Australia. We've got a real stake in the success of ASEAN, and this is fascinating to watch it. It's fascinating to watch the social arguments, the social moves, the life of Islam. Islam is certainly an important issue in the world now, and by working on Islam in Indonesia, it becomes easier to understand what is happening to the Islamic debates across the world, and a range of other issues. Including things like economic growth. What happens when 2 or 3 billion Asians become richer and start demanding more energy? Energy poverty is still a crucial issue across Asia. We don't talk about it in Australia. We talk about the challenges of curbing energy use, but the real challenge across Asia is energy poverty. They need much more energy, and we don't seem to have understood that. So by studying Indonesia and looking at these sorts of things, we get a better understanding, I think, of the issues in the region.
The line has always been that no two neighbours in the world share less than Indonesia and Australia. Can these two neighbours build a relationship now based on a shared democracy and perhaps a shared, robust sense of humour? Is that enough?
Well, I do think it's difficult. It's difficult because, as you say, the two countries are very different. They are extremely different. On one hand, in Australia, we have a largely white, not entirely white, obviously, but white, monolingual Anglo-Saxon culture. We tend to identify with countries such as the United States, Canada, United Kingdom, and so on. And we find ourselves next to a country of 250 million people, the world's largest Muslim country, going through a period of great turmoil. It's very difficult for either country, really, to understand each other. And I think the elite of Indonesia probably understand us better than we understand collectively the elite of Indonesia. More of them have spent time in Australia. For example, the person who's just finishing up as Vice President of Indonesia, Dr Budiono, got his 2 first degrees in Australia, knows Australia extremely well. ASPI, the President, is clearly sympathetic and friendly towards Australia.
It's interesting. Why has ASPI been, in a sense, the best Indonesian President for Australia? Why has he felt that attachment or that interest in Australia?
He was, I think it probably stems more from his feeling that he would like allies in the region, allies in the world. He sees Australia, as indeed most of the elite of Indonesia see Australia, as non-threatening. One of the things that's important about Australia is that we can be an irritation. We have the capacity to irritate, but our intentions are usually good. We're not setting out to threaten Indonesia, and it is very clear across the Australian political elite that the Australian political elite, although they don't really understand Indonesia, do understand it's important. Understand it's important it succeeds, and understand that it's in Australia's interests that it succeeds. Now, on the Indonesian side, that is understood and it's appreciated. SPY's main challenge really was to work across ASEAN and more broadly, and broadly speaking, generally, I think he saw Australia as 90% an ally and perhaps 10% a difficulty, but essentially an ally.
Let's finish with this idea, which I like, that one of the things that Indonesia and Australia can share is a sense of humour. So let's finish with the jokes. I mean, it's said that the quintessential Australian joke is that the police go to an accident out in the outback, and when they arrive, the vehicle tracks, the tyre tracks show that the vehicle has swerved to miss a dingo and then accelerated to run over a politician. Boom, boom. Now, what is the equivalent? What is the quintessential Indonesian joke or jokes?
Well, I think I can think of 2 of them that in a way capture, to some extent, capture the spirit of Indonesia at present. The first is, given all the emphasis on general elections at present, one of the Indonesian jokes, and of course it's been something that they've referred to for many years, but the Indonesians have joked that these days we have general elections, and that's a good thing, because in the past all we used to have was an election of generals, and they laugh heartily. They laugh at themselves when they say this. And the other joke that they tell constantly now, because of their worry, I guess, about the possibility of a democracy which, if anything, is sometimes too vigorous or too uncontrolled, many Indonesians will say now that we don't really have democracy in Indonesia. What we have is democracy.
Welcome to that, President Widodo. Peter McCawley, thank you.